Trigger warning. This podcast episode contains discussions of emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse, as well as physical abuse and financial abuse. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Liendo, and I'm so glad you're here. So I have a really cool achievement to announce today. This is the podcast's 25th episode. Every milestone that Emotional Abuse is Real reaches still boggles my mind, because I really wasn't sure what I was doing when I first started this project back in March. But the more episodes I create, the more people who are willing to come forward to share their stories and insights. And for that, I am so grateful. Also, quick note, if I sound a little groggy today, just so you know, I am recuperating from getting both my COVID booster and my flu shot yesterday. So just bear with me. I'm fine to do this, but I definitely have to take it easy today. But as a reminder, definitely get your flu shot and your COVID booster. Before we get into today's episode, a reminder that Emotional Abuse is Real still needs your support, and there are several ways you can do that. First of all, if you're a listener and you've been mulling over sharing your story, please don't hesitate to reach out via Instagram at Sarene Lieds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites. Or you can reach out via our Emotional Abuse is Real Facebook page or via email at hello@SareneLeedsWrites.com. A reminder that anonymous guests are always welcome. Another way you can support Emotional Abuse is Real is by heading over to Apple Podcasts and both leaving a rating and writing a review. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for people to find this podcast. Finally, you can support the podcast by following me on Instagram at Sarene Lieds Writes and following our Facebook page, Emotional Abuse is Real. And if you are able, please consider donating to our Buy Me a Coffee page, which I've linked in the show notes. As I've said before, this is a one-woman operation, and your donations help fund the podcast's production costs. I'd also like to remind you about my free newsletter. This is a great opportunity to stay up to date on my latest published articles as well as new podcast episodes. Also, it's a wonderful way to stay in touch with me directly, especially if you are a business or brand owner looking to punch up your website, email, or social media copy. I am available to work with you on any writing or editing you may need with your business and brand copy. Plus, as an added bonus, I send out a free delicious dessert recipe to every new subscriber. I've left the sign-up link in the show notes. You can also subscribe directly via my website, SareneLeedsWrites.com. That's SareneLeedsWrites.com. My guest for today's episode is emotional abuse survivor, author, and advocate, Mirlo Liendo. Mirlo's book, Finding Courage in the Conflict, is a great resource for both people experiencing emotional and narcissistic abuse, as well as those who want to learn how to identify this very specific type of abuse. Mirlo highlights numerous red flags associated with narcissistic abuse in her book, all of which she gleaned from personal experience. Since leaving her husband, Mirlo has dedicated her time to helping others who find themselves in abusive domestic situations, whether it's helping people navigate their divorce proceedings, find mental health providers, or safe housing. Mirlo is definitely someone you want in your corner if you are emerging from an emotionally abusive relationship. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Mirlo Liendo.
My name is Mirlo Liendo. I am a 18 plus years survivor of abuse, emotional abuse. I am a mother. I am a youth justice counselor. I am an author, and I am a community member of a community that provides a safe space and guidance to women who are thinking about leaving abusive relationships. So I help women develop safety plans um, and connect them to resources in the city where they can get the help that they need to safely exit.
You're doing such important work, and I'm so glad that you are here on the podcast, because I do hear from listeners who, a lot of them are in the position where this podcast has helped them to realize that something is wrong in their relationship, but they're not ready to leave yet, and they don't know what their next steps are. So we'll definitely be talking about that. So I'd like to open up the floor to you to please share your emotional abuse story.
Well, it goes back to many, 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 many years,
Yeah.
decades.
Sure.
As you know, most people who are survivors of abuse can attest to. It's often
Yes.
something that's been lifelong and something that many of us don't realize until a lot of years later and many, many years into our adulthood. So I met my ex in high school, and I was a single mom.
Mm-hmm.
I was very young. I wasn't looking for a relationship at the time. I was just focused on finishing school and being a mom. And, you know, like many men who are abusers, he came in very charismatic, very gentle, very funny. He had or appeared to have a lot of friends. Um, and I felt special
Mm-hmm.
that he, you know, wanted to spend his time with me, and that he wanted to, for lack of a better word, date me. And there were a lot of signs in the very beginning, as there always are, and many of us just don't know what we're looking at.
No,
So,
we don't.
um, yeah, there were a lot of things. Like, I was, you know, emotionally unavailable at the time, which, you know, I now know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so he gave me a lot of space, um, which I thought I liked. I thought was a good thing at the time. But what that also turned into was him disappearing sometimes for like a week. I wouldn't hear from him, or
Mm.
2 weeks. I wouldn't hear from him. And this was like after high school and further into our relationship. Um, and then he would call me and act like nothing happened, or say, like, why didn't you call me 5 times instead of 2 times? I really wanted to hear from you. I was having a really hard time. And that's when, you know, he started tugging on my heartstrings and
Mm-hmm.
victimizing himself, and making it seem like, you know, he needed a savior, and that was going to be me. Um, and from there, you know, things just got progressively worse over many, many, many years. And you know what I tell a lot of people is it's often like a dripping faucet. You know, you don't
Mm-hmm.
really notice it. Like, it's
Yeah.
little, very tiny, tiny things over the course of sometimes years or decades,
Yeah.
and you don't realize that there's corrosion happening in the sink. You don't realize that there's problems with the pipes. You don't until it's all compounded into like a
Yeah.
big, very obvious problem. And I actually didn't realize that there was all of this emotional abuse happening until years after we were married, and the
Mm-hmm.
physical abuse had started.
Yeah.
And even after I had left him, and through, you know, many years of therapy and talking openly, and speaking to people like yourself on podcasts, and talking to friends and family and trusted people openly about what was going on, did I realize, as I was saying the words out loud, that there was so much emotional
Yeah.
abuse that had been taking place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I had, as a very young woman, I had, a very like a very thick line in the sand. And I'd always told him, there's a lot of things I'll tolerate, but I'm not going to tolerate cheating. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things I'm going to tolerate, but I'm not going to tolerate physical abuse.
Sure.
And so the cheating, I like now I look back and I think he probably was cheating.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
never actually really caught him, but why wouldn't he? Because he didn't value our relationship or me
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
any way, shape, or form, anyways. Um, and the physical abuse didn't start until after we were engaged to be married and the wedding was planned. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Ugh. Put you in
so
such a difficult position.
yeah, and at the time we had had two more children
Sure.
by that point, and he had the kids involved in the proposal,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
knew about it, and it was a
Yeah.
surprise, and it happened on my birthday. And I was very clear with him too, like for all the years prior to that, 10 years
Mm-hmm.
prior to that, that I didn't want to get married.
Mm.
And so, and that in itself, like that just one incident is a huge example of emotional abuse,
He
right?
loved bombed you
Yeah.
into saying, yes, oh yes, marriage, yes, it's so beautiful. The kids are
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
actually, I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel excited. I actually felt scared and I felt let
Mm.
down and I felt unheard.
Okay.
And I felt angry,
Sure.
that he had the kids excited and involved. And it
Yeah.
put me in a position, really like backed me into a corner, which was typical of him,
Mm-hmm.
where I felt like I couldn't say no.
Right.
Um,
Your feelings didn't matter.
yeah, yeah. And,
Mm-hmm.
I knew at the time that marriage the wasn't the answer. I actually knew at the time that the relationship wasn't
Mm-hmm.
healthy or safe, but I had no name for anything. It was so long ago that,
Right.
there was no social media, there were no books, there were no people to talk to about these types of things.
Totally.
So I was very siloed, and isolated, and I didn't know how to
Yeah.
talk about any of these things because I also didn't want to make him look bad, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, and I know a lot of young women really feel like that, like they feel responsible for the way the rest of the world sees their partner,
Yeah.
particularly when there's instance of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and of course, the groundwork is laid many, many years or months before that too, with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of talk about privacy and, them saying I'm a very private person and, I don't want everybody to know my business and I'm not on social media. Like it's a very
Yeah.
typical one now. And so you're also subconsciously getting this messaging that you shouldn't be talking about what's happening in the relationship.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there was a lot of emotional abuse that took place, and then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, after the marriage, it turned in, and this is over the course of like 10, 11, 12 years now,
Mm-hmm.
is when the name calling really started, and the devaluing through the name calling. So, um, and the accusing me of doing things I wasn't doing. So the
Oh,
really
yeah.
hardcore gaslighting in front of the kids,
Oh,
right? And so
oh God, that's the worst.
also
Yeah.
knowing that you're planting the seed in the kid's head, of things that didn't actually happen was so frustrating. So, there would be nights that he just wouldn't come home, and I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't. Um, I actually liked it better when he didn't come home at that point.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
I slept better. It was great.
Sure.
Um, and he would push and push and want me to ask questions, and he would wait until all the kids were having breakfast at the table and he'd be like, well, you didn't even, I could have been dead last night. You didn't even ask me where I was. And I'd say, okay, well, where were you? And he'd
Yeah.
be, tell me where he was. And I'd say, okay, like, great. And he'd be like, you don't ask me because you're cheating on me. And I was like,
Oh my God. Oh
whoa,
my,
what?
yeah. Yeah. That,
What are you
that,
talking?
that is speaking as a non-professional, that is such a typical line
Yeah.
from a
Yeah.
narcissistic emotional abuser. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh
then,
yeah.
and saying these things in front of the kids where I'm now like trying to defend myself, but you've planted the seed in the house
Yep.
already, in the home, to kids who trust and love and look forward to and look to their parents for guidance and reassurance, right? And so then the kids are often left confused, wondering what's real and what's not.
Sure.
Um, Rewriting history is a big one for him too. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
whenever there would be like a huge blowout, and he would push me and push me and push me and push me, emotionally, psychologically, physically, and the kids would be within earshot, but then, like, as soon as he became physical, he would start the rewriting history already,
Mm,
like verbally and very loud. And so he would,
yeah.
walk around the house saying, like, you just want to see me go to jail, and I didn't do anything to you. I don't know why you're making all that noise. I barely even touched you. Like, so the kids were getting like all of these messages too, and just trying
Yeah.
to convince everybody in the home that um, things happened very differently than they did. And I mean, those are
Yeah.
things I typically don't talk about, things that happen directly to the kids, because some of them
Sure.
have asked me not to.
Of course.
And then
Yeah.
the others are like, go for it. But the rewriting history happened a lot in relation to the
Hmm.
children, for sure. And that was one of the most frustrating things too. And, that level of emotional abuse, like as a mother,
Yeah.
was something that was so tough, and still is. Like, I left 12 years ago.
Right.
It's still really, really hard, or 11
Yeah.
years ago, but it's still really hard because, I've got all of this guilt, because he knew from the very beginning, from the day he found out that I had a young son, that my
Hmm.
kids were always going to be my priority, and that being
Hmm.
a mom and being a good, healthy, safe parent was always
Yep.
the most important thing to me.
Sure.
And his ability to tear that apart, um, and I think he knows that has left me with a lot of guilt and a lot of like hard feelings. And these are things that I'm, likely going to have to work through forever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because,
Yeah,
of course, you shouldn't feel guilt, but I understand why
yeah,
you have
yeah.
it and why you do need to work through it. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, so the marriage ended over a decade ago, but at the same time, he's still their father. So
Yeah,
he's never going to be completely out of your life. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And that's real. I mean, the post separation abuse actually was very, and still, still is, but I've got a better handle on it now that the youngest is older.
Yeah.
But in all of those years after I left too, without the language to talk about it, without
Yeah.
understanding what was going on, and all of the judicial abuse that took place, the
Yeah.
post separation abuse is emotional and psychological abuse in itself.
Absolutely. And we do speak about that a lot on the podcast, especially
Mm-hmm.
the judicial aspect. I do
Yep.
have an interview coming up with a couple of lawyers who specialize in these kinds of
Yes.
divorces because
Yep.
this needs to be discussed. I had as a guest, she's an emotional abuse coach, but she got certified in high conflict divorce coaching
Excellent.
because
Yeah.
it is so necessary. Yeah,
Yep.
I was going to ask, like, yeah, you well in the relationship, sure, but I can't imagine what it was like ending the relationship and going through that post separation. It had to have been just as bad, if not worse.
It was. It was worse. In a lot of aspects, and some of them were. It was worse in that now the courts had ordered my kids be with him 50% of the time, so now they were
Mm,
unsupervised.
yeah,
So that was really, really, really hard for me. I had never been away from my kids,
yeah,
so that was also really hard. And he really pulled out all of the stuff. Like, I thought we would be protected, and we weren't. And so all of the things that I thought, all of the legs I thought I had to stand on didn't exist. So, me getting a new home, which was really, really challenging,
hmm
because of all the financial abuse that took place, which is an
ah,
entire other
Yeah,
Another
and I
leg,
know that
another
that's part, and I
podcast.
know that that
Yeah.
happens a lot. And I always say that the reason why I've learned to not say to people, "Well, why don't you just leave?" is because I know financial abuse is a huge component, and so many
Yeah.
women, especially, are financially
It
dependent
was
on their partners.
awful. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was awful. And, trying to create a new healthy environment for my kids. I mean, with the post-separation abuse, like, in the very beginning, he would
yeah,
step into my home
mm,
and he would come into the front, like the foyer,
yeah,
and he would talk very loud and he would laugh. And he has this maniacal laugh that like
mm,
nobody knows but us,
of
and it's
course.
like a snicker, like it's very like undermining. And he would come
Yeah,
into my home and he would do that, and he would um, give those looks that only people who have experienced this type of abuse know, right? And he would,
mm-hmm.
and so my nervous system was just firing, and I
Ugh,
was so like uneasy, and I would have nightmares, and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, and I wouldn't be able to function at work. And it was and so, I made the decision to not allow him inside my home.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, from there, the barrage of accusations started
Yeah.
again with my kids in his home, unsupervised,
Ugh,
with other adults and other family members there believing his story. So that makes it more true in the eyes of the children, right? That I'm just being
yep.
difficult, and he
Mm-hmm.
just wants to come in and see where his kids are living because he's concerned. Like, and it's all lies.
Yeah,
And from there, going to parent teacher interviews was another one, and still trying to show up as a family, and then realizing
sure.
that this is really like more than uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And he would do things like um, he would he's an entire foot taller than me and 100 pounds
Mm,
heavier than me,
mm,
but he would
yeah.
wait until I was like within 8 feet of him, and he would like flinch, like he was afraid of me. Like, it was so bizarre, like these things that he would do. And then I was like, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm
Yeah,
not going to these I'm not doing this. And I ended, and this
good.
was before it was even a thing, as I contacted all of the kids teachers. I said, I left this man because he's an abuser. I
Yeah,
am not coming to parent teacher interviews. Do not CC me on emails with him. I know this is going to be more work for you, but if you need to contact me. We do not speak. Do not ask him to relay information. Like, I really had to go through all of these steps
yeah.
before this was commonplace.
Yeah, I was just about to say, because my daughter is 7. So from the start, whether it's her preschool, school, camp, those kinds of documentations
Mm-hmm.
where, you have to specify, do you have no contact with the parent? Do you, what
Yeah,
is the situation? This was there. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And you had to
yeah.
go through that because this is clearly a recent thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ugh, yeah,
Yeah. And just so then going through all of those steps. So the emotional abuse really continued
sure.
after I left. And, he would do things like he would text me really,
Hmm.
or call me
Ugh.
really early in the morning, knowing that I would still be asleep. And he would just start
Hmm.
accusing me of things and tearing me
Ugh.
down, and, being belligerent, belittling me, devaluing me as a parent and as a mother. And it would like
Ugh.
completely throw me off for days.
Sure,
And
sure.
so, I had to call him and or message him and say, I'm only going to communicate with you in writing
Yeah, good.
and through text
Yeah,
and email. Do not call me. I will not answer the phone.
good for you.
Um, and so, he continued to call for a little while, and, then he would start the text messages with, well, like, since you're not talking to me because you're so childish, things like that. So,
Ugh.
and then more recently, about 3 years ago, a friend of mine said, because every time my phone would go off and it would be him,
Yeah,
I would have this like reaction.
sure.
Like, my nerves would just be on edge. And so a friend of mine a few years ago was like, just put your phone on, or put his number on do not disturb, which I didn't know you could do.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good to know.
That was a game changer for
Oh,
me,
that's
because now
amazing.
I don't even
Great.
see that he's texted me until I look for it.
Right.
And then I can choose, am I in the headspace right now to be able to answer this or to even read it?
You are in control by doing that. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you to your friend who
Yeah.
turned you on to that. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Great.
And so, and with that too, he doesn't really message me anymore. There's no need to.
Yeah.
Our
Right.
youngest is 16.
Okay.
Um, but prior to my youngest, becoming older, and
Yeah.
um, I would often also respond to his text messages in my notes, and I would leave it overnight. And
Good.
then I would go back to it in the morning because
So smart.
a little piece of control and power that I do have and always had in this relationship, what drove him nuts, is that I'm
Mm-hmm.
very sarcastic. I am witty, I am funny, and he has zero use for my sense of humor.
It's awesome.
And yeah, so I would often respond. Like sometimes I would, because he's a college professor, so sometimes I
Mhm.
would correct his spelling.
Ha ha ha.
Sometimes I would, respond in a way that was sarcastic,
Mhm.
knowing. But then over time also I let that go because I realized that I'm just poking the bear here, and I don't need to.
Yeah.
Um, and any attention for him is good attention, because what he does is he
Right.
uses that, and he'll cut and paste little pieces of the text messages and show people, and then use that to victimize himself, right? Like, this is what I mean.
Please.
I'm just checking on the children. I'm just, trying to
And
do
look
the
at how
best that I
neat
can.
she is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was
Oh,
like, I'm not even
please.
giving you that anymore.
Exactly. That's the thing.
Yeah.
All they want is attention. So,
Yes. Yeah.
so what was your healing process like?
It really started with, because I left to what looked like the rest of the world very
Hmm.
abruptly. For
Yeah.
me, there were a
Hmm.
lot of years of crying and rage and anger and disappointment in myself, and um, kind of planning in my head without jumping out head first. So the healing really started with me leaving and realizing who was safe and who wasn't. And
Hmm.
that because, our friends and family had become very enmeshed, right? So
Yeah.
his family members were my friends. And I didn't know like um, who was going to believe me. He's a very highly regarded member of the community, of his
That's always
family.
the case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's all like, if you could name any of the things, he is all of them.
Yeah.
And so it was realizing who wasn't asking me any questions but offering help.
Hmm.
So I did have a handful of friends who were very, very old friends of mine from high
Hmm.
school and elementary school, who would say, you don't need to explain anything. What can I do? What do you need? Period.
Great.
Um, and they just trusted me. They trusted that I was doing the
Mm.
right thing, because um, nobody with four kids and
Sure.
um, a two income household, and a home and a
Yeah.
car, two cars, and like all of the
Yeah.
things, just gets up
Yeah.
and leaves because they're bored or doesn't feel like it being married
Right.
anymore, right? Like, that
Yeah.
doesn't happen.
No.
And so the people who recognized that became my safe people, because there were
Good.
people who would call me and ask me what happened,
Yeah.
who just wanted information, they wanted
Hmm.
intel, they wanted to know. And I found out very quickly they wanted to know, because then they were asking him the same questions, and then they were having conversations with him and
Hmm.
comparing the stories, right? And
Yeah.
so once I had realized, who my safe people were,
Hmm.
I started to talk out loud. And, as anybody who's been through an abusive situation knows, it's when you say the words out loud that
Yeah.
they really start to register. And when
Yeah.
you say the words out loud and you see the people who love you's reaction
Yes.
to what you're saying, you're like,
Yeah.
wow, like,
Yes.
this is a lot. Like,
Hmm.
I'm doing the right thing. Um,
Hmm.
And I had a lot of support. There was a point where we were
Great.
homeless. I had a girlfriend
Oh,
who opened up her home to me and all my kids and said,
oh,
no problem. Just come. I have lots of space. Just come. There
wonderful.
were times I didn't have money for groceries.
Sure.
And at times I did try and reach out to my ex to say, like, I don't have money to feed the kids. And he'd be like, that's
Yeah.
your problem. You shouldn't have left. So then having to go to food banks and then
Mm-hmm.
like telling the kids, like, your mother's a loser because she goes to a food bank. So there was a lot of
Ugh.
things like that. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, like back to the question, now that I've gone off
Yes.
on a tangent, it
That's
is,
okay.
building my community of people who I could
Yes.
trust and holding on to those friendships really, really tightly. And also, I work in the space of, counseling young people. So
Yeah.
also being very like cognizant of like not triggering the people around me or like trauma dumping
Mm-hmm.
and giving too much information, but talking more about, how I was feeling and how I'm moving forward.
Wonderful.
And,
Yeah.
when all of the talking, I think, ran out and I knew I was ready for the next level of work is
Mm-hmm.
when I started doing my search for a therapist who
Mm-hmm.
specialized in narcissistic abuse, in trauma work, um, and divorce, and she had all of these specialties that I knew I needed. I had actually learned from going through the courts, going through all of the lawyers who had no idea what was going on and were telling me just to give my ex the kids, and acting like I was unstable because, like, what woman wouldn't want all this free time? Um, and so I realized that, like, people really don't know and don't understand. And I also knew that my therapist needed to have a really clear understanding of what I went through.
Yeah.
And so it was about a year and a half or 2 years. I
Okay.
interviewed about 8 people,
Mm-hmm.
went
Yeah.
through their modalities to see like what would be a good fit, went
Mm-hmm.
on a waiting list, and
Yep.
um, I did like a bunch of years of trauma therapy.
Good.
And also, I always have to recognize how much of a privilege that was because she is
Yeah.
not cheap.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had some coverage through my work, and it
Mm-hmm.
saddens me that people don't have access to this, this level of care
It
and
saddens me
community
too,
care.
because
Yeah.
I am very, very vocal about the importance of therapy, and that, like you
Hmm.
said, it's a privilege.
Yes, it is.
And I'm so happy that you were able to find a provider who specializes in narcissistic abuse, because
Yeah,
even that is still hard to find.
it is. It
Yeah.
really is. And she really had a good understanding too of the trauma work that needed to be done,
Good.
and how to talk to me about working with the reactions that my nervous system was having,
Ah,
and
yes.
really helped me through some stuff too. Like, I've since, like, I developed really, really really bad anxiety after
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
left,
Yeah.
and you know working so much, for years I was working 7 days a week. I had four
Mm-hmm.
jobs. I was just it's trying to manage my household and do all of these things. I
Yeah.
didn't
Something's got to give.
recognize Yeah, I didn't recognize that the anxiety had gotten so bad. So that was another
Yeah.
piece of working with this particular therapist, where she very gently said, like, we've gone through all of the tools and you're still really, really struggling. I think you need to talk to your doctor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as much as I didn't want to do that, and
Yeah.
I work in the space of mental health, but being told that I need medication was
Yeah.
still kind of stung a little bit, right? So,
Sure. Sure. Yep.
um, but I did that, and it was probably the best thing that I did. And then that
Yes.
allowed me to really gain what I needed to gain from the therapy experience as well.
Wonderful.
Um, yeah, but the growth is forever. And
Yeah.
that was another thing that was a really tough pill for me to swallow because, a couple months into therapy, I'm like, am I fixed?
Right. Oh, yeah. 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 Yeah.
Am I good
Oh
now?
no.
Yeah.
Oh
And she was
no.
like,
No,
no, no.
that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Not at all. But I
Yeah.
did want to give you a chance to talk about your book because,
Thank you.
now that you've told your story, you've talked about your own healing process. Now I want to hear all about what you do to help others in similar situations. So you have written a book about your experiences called Finding Courage in the Conflict. Yeah, like what, please, I hate to say tell me about it because I'm sorry I haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, but
It's all good.
yeah, please.
So, what started out just as, just to kind of roll it back a little bit,
Sure.
early in my relationship, I had been journaling.
Hmm.
And something I had started to do, which is what I recommend people do now too,
Oh,
is I
yes.
started journaling the incidents of violence. And I started
Yes.
journaling like what was happening because I was so confused. You're like in this
Yep.
cloud of confusion constantly, um, just to make sense of the gaslighting
Mhm.
and the emotional pieces and to remember, right? So when things got really good again, to remember the lowest lows, right? And so I had been journaling that kind of stuff. And I realized at one point that my ex had been going through my journals. And I
Yeah.
tore them all up. I tore them up. I
Hmm.
threw them out. I felt so violated.
Yeah.
And I never went back to it. And so after I left him, I started again. And I
Hmm.
started to write because I needed to make sense of what was going on, which, I'm sure everybody in that position wants to do. And um, then I decided I wanted to write a book. And then I
Hmm.
realized really quickly, and like having these conversations with other women, um, that I wasn't the only one.
Hmm.
There was like, this really is like a worldwide, enormous piece of abuse
Yeah.
towards families, like women, children, and
Yeah.
men, which I
Yeah.
don't talk about very often because it's not my experience. But,
Right.
um, and I realized, for lack of a better term, that I wasn't like just one of one. I wasn't like like I wasn't special in this thing. It like this happens everywhere, so like why would that I write about my experience? And so what I did instead over the course of some years and through more writing was I wrote a book highlighting the red flags
Hmm.
that I had noticed in the very beginning of my relationship that I didn't have language for.
Hmm.
um, and so things like gaslighting
Yeah.
and love bombing and
Hmm.
all of these things. And so what the book is, it's 13 red flags, and
Ah.
it's just the very basics, like the very beginning stages of things that I noticed that weren't right. It gives an example, and then it like a personal example, and then it rolls into more of a practical example. So
Okay.
I've taken the clinical language out
Hmm.
of it. It's written very simply because at the time I left, there were no books,
Yeah.
there was no literature,
Hmm.
and if there was anything, they were very clinically written.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I had at one point attended the Barbara Schleifer Clinic in Toronto, looking for
Hmm.
support for community and all of these things. And I was floored by how many women attended these programs that really
Yeah.
needed help, and their waiting lists they just didn't have the capacity um, to help everybody. And what I was seeing is I was seeing people from different cultures. I was seeing like newcomers to the country. I was seeing um, women with disabilities. There was just this huge, vast array of different people. And I thought, I work with teenagers. So I was like, you know what, I need to write this book in a way that's not super clinical, in everyday
Exactly.
language so people can just understand it. I wanted it to sound like a conversation. And
Yeah.
really, I wanted it to be, if I was going to have a conversation with a younger person who's in the beginning stages of a relationship like this, how would I
Yeah.
describe this to them?
Yeah.
And so that's what I did.
It's great. Because
And
unless you are a clinician, you don't want to read something that's clinical.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And the truth is, not everybody has the capacity to read something that's clinical either.
Correct.
And so that's the reality of it too, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm very aware of that. I thought, you know what, let all of the super educated clinical people have their piece. They have all of the books in the world with all the big language and all of that, but there's also a demographic of women who really you need to understand.
Yeah.
And that's communication, right? And
Absolutely.
is understanding each other.
It's great.
And so
I'm
that's
so
what I did.
good. I'm so glad you did that because I find that when you're young, you think you know everything, but it's really the time in your life where you don't know
Yep.
anything.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. And is it available on Amazon
It's available
website?
on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble.
Okay,
So it's available Canadian and American Amazon.
fantastic.
Um, yeah, and
I'll drop a link, but yeah,
thank you. And
you're
I'm in the
welcome.
process of publishing a guided journal to go with the book as well
Wonderful, wonderful.
as
Any
a
idea
next step.
when that will be available or
I'm
that? Yeah.
hoping before Christmas.
Oh, great.
Right. And so,
Great.
and that this one also includes some safety planning tips.
Okay.
Um, and so that's also such a huge part, and not just
Yeah.
physically planning safety, but emotionally and psychologically, safety
Exactly.
planning.
So, on that note, I would love to hear about what you do now to help others who are in the situation that you were 10, 11 years ago. And also, any advice that you would give to someone listening to this podcast who knows that something's wrong in their relationship, but they don't know what to do next.
Right. And so what I do right now
Mm-hmm.
is, aside from work,
Yes.
which is a completely different entity,
Mm-hmm.
on my own time, I don't probably between 50 and 100 women at this point.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Safety plan, talk
Mm-hmm.
through their emotions, talk through the practical pieces, what they have control of and what they don't,
Mm-hmm.
and help connect them to community resources, how to find a lawyer, how to
Mm-hmm.
find a therapist or a counselor, how to talk to your doctor, how to talk to the schools, how to talk to bosses if there's, or, HR if there
Yep.
are safety issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just something that I've really done on my own time. And
It's great.
also, just there's been a lot of times where I've just listened. Sometimes they
Mm-hmm.
just need somebody to listen and to
Yes.
understand and to not question
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I've been doing on my own time because it really takes a community to
Yes.
help support each other um, through these things. So, like, it's leaving my ex-husband was the hardest thing I've ever done. Like,
Yeah.
and that's an understatement.
Yep.
I've done a lot of really hard things and I've lived a
Yeah.
really hard life, like prior
Mm-hmm.
to even meeting my ex, but leaving him
Mm-hmm.
and restarting my life from scratch was really the hardest thing I've ever done. And
Of
so,
course.
I like to provide some preparation in the event
Mm-hmm.
because that's not always the case,
Yeah.
right? And so that's for some people they leave and they have an opportunity to start over, and it's not the hardest thing in the world. But
Mm-hmm.
for some people it is,
Yeah.
and I wish somebody had told me that because I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
Sure.
Would the outcome have been different? Probably not, but at
Mm-hmm.
least a heads up would have been
Yeah.
nice, right? So,
Yeah.
um, And then, sorry, I don't remember what the other question
Oh, no,
was.
that's all right. Yeah, I threw both questions at you at once. What would you say to people who are listening right now who know that there is something unhealthy or toxic about their relationship, but they don't quite know what they should do?
One thing I often tell people is if you can't openly and honestly have a conversation with somebody you trust, a
Mm-hmm.
friend or a family member, and tell them everything
Mm-hmm.
about your partner, then something is very wrong.
Okay.
And not that you should. You don't
Right.
need to, call your mom or your sister or your cousin or your best friend and be like, I'm going to tell you 52 things about my partner right now that you don't need to know. Like it has nothing to do with that, but
Right.
are you keeping secrets and are you hiding things? Because if you're hiding things, something is really wrong. And
Yeah.
there are 8 billion people in this world, and you need none of them to be your partner, but there's
Mm-hmm.
still like 8 billion people is a lot of people.
Yeah.
Um, and we all deserve to have somebody, if we choose to, who respects us all the time.
Yes.
More than anything, 100% of the time, who respects us, who cherishes us, who values our presence the same way that our best friends do. One thing I often tell these young people that I work with is, has your best friend ever hurt you?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time they say no.
No.
My best friends have never hurt me, ever.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Yeah.
I can have that relationship with these people, I can also have that relationship with a
With a
man
with a
or
partner.
with a
Yeah.
partner, right?
Right.
And so, um, that's one piece of advice that I give people,
Mm-hmm.
because you can start over anytime.
Yeah.
It never has to be this. Like,
Yeah.
what's happening in this moment never has to be this. We have so much choice.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention how important journaling everything out is, because when I was going through my abuse, I was abused by my boss at Rolling Stone 9 years ago. And I kept a bullying log. And when I decided to start this podcast, I went back and I read all of that. And I was like, I can't believe I let this happen.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
mind boggling and it's so important.
And I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up too, because one
Yeah.
thing I didn't realize is that these abusers are always in any position of power. So they're
Oh,
not
yeah.
just your partners.
Mm-mm.
I also, after I left my ex, I had a
Yeah.
boss. I got a new job, and I had
Yeah.
this boss who was my ex in another form. He
Oh,
was so abusive.
yeah.
And yeah, I wish I had written down and kept a log. I ended up leaving there and having to sign an NDA to get paid. But
Ugh.
yeah, so I
But
mean,
they they
I don't
really
talk about
are
that.
everywhere. I've
Yeah,
been really fortunate in that I have not had an emotionally abusive partner, but especially because this was a boss, no one thought that this was a big deal.
of
Everyone was just like,
course.
just deal with it, just get
Yeah,
over it. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So, how can people connect with you? Social media, website? Yeah.
Yes. So I am on social media.
Hmm.
So I have a page called Courage in the Conflict,
Hmm.
on Instagram, and that page I've left solely for information about abuse.
Hmm. Okay.
And we've built, completely separate community there.
Okay.
I'm also on Instagram as Miss Mirlo. That's just, I am who I am. And so a lot of that still focuses on abuse, but it's funny.
Okay.
Um, and it's a little more light, and sometimes it's not. So sometimes I think I throw people off. And it's a little more personal.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
both pages are open. So people are welcome
Okay.
to follow me on either one of those. I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not super, super active on there.
That's fine.
But I'm still there.
Okay.
And
I'll
yeah,
throw up links
yeah.
for your Instagrams and to purchase your books. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
Merlot, it's been a pleasure. Thank
It
you
really
so
has.
much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
this was
Thank
great. This
you.
really, really was. I'm so glad we've connected. And I'm checking the time and it looks like, yeah, we got it. Cause I know that you have an appointment at 1.
Mhm.
So I'm really glad we were able to do this. And thank you so much. It was a pleasure
Thank
speaking with
you.
you.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much.
Thank you for listening to my chat with Mirlo Liendo on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to connect with Mirlo and purchase her book, Finding Courage in the Conflict, I've left those links in the show notes. And if you would like to share your own emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out at hello@sereneleadsrights.com. Reach out via our Facebook page, Emotional Abuse is Real, or through Instagram at Serene Leads Rights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988. Or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, S-T-A-R-T, to 88788. Please note that these are American-based helplines. However, in honor of today's Canadian guest, Mirlo Liendo, I'm happy to announce that Canada will be launching its own 988 Suicide and Crisis Hotline on November 30th, 2023. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. Sign up for my free newsletter. And if you can, please support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.